Good afternoon, students. Today we're going to talk about sentence revision. How can I have sentence variety in my paper? So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can learn about how you can make your simple sentences and combine different ways in which you can combine your simple sentences so that you don't have the same sentences over and over again. Emphasize key ideas. Within each sentence, emphasize your point by expressing it in the subject and verb of an independent clause, the words that receive the most attention from the reader. Within longer stretches of prose, you can draw attention to ideas deserving special emphasis by using a variety of techniques, often involving an unusual twist or some element of surprise. So there are two ways in which you can change your sentences around to give it more variety. You can either use coordinating conjunctions or subordinating conjunctions. That's easy to remember, right? Subordinating conjunctions, coordinating conjunctions. When you use coordinating conjunctions, those are known as fanboys: for, and, but, or, nor, so, yet. So coordinating conjunctions combine two sentences of equal significance. So when combining two, and this is called a compound sentence. So coordinate equal ideas. When combining two or more ideas in one sentence, you have two choices. Either you can do coordinating conjunctions or subordinating conjunctions. Choose coordinating conjunctions to indicate that the ideas are equal or nearly equal in importance. Choose subordinating conjunctions to indicate that one idea is less important than another. Coordination. Coordination draws attention equally to two or more ideas. To coordinate single words or phrases, join them with a coordinating conjunction or with a pair of correlative conjunctions, such as bananas and strawberries. Not only a lackluster plot, but also inferior acting. To coordinate independent clauses, word groups that express a complete idea and can stand alone as a sentence, join them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction or with a semicolon. So you always use a comma in front of fanboys, you would say. And this is known as a compound sentence. Example, Robert is poor, but Mary is rich. So here you have two sentences of equal importance separated by a coordinating conjunction, but, and then you're going to put a comma in between the two sentences. So, or you could put a semicolon. The semicolon, and then if you use a transition word such as moreover or however, then you would use a comma and a semicolon. So the semicolon is often accompanied by a conjunctive adverb, or also known as a transition word, such as moreover, furthermore, therefore, or however, or by a transitional phrase such as for example, in other words, as a matter of fact. Assume, for example, that your intention is to draw equal attention to the following two ideas. Social networking websites offer ways for people to connect in the virtual world. They do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction. So let's say you have two sentences in your essay of equal importance, and you want to combine the two sentences together so that you have more sentence variety. So if you want, you can add in fanboys, a coordinating conjunction, so that you can have the two sentences of equal importance combined together. So to coordinate these ideas of social media offering people ways to connect, as well as social media does not replace face-to-face interactions. So let's place these two together and put "and" in the middle. And so you would have social networking websites offer ways for people to connect in the virtual world, but they do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction. Or you could say social networking websites offer ways for people to connect in the virtual world, semicolon, however, comma, They do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction. So you have the choice of either using fanboys, and you have to have a comma between the two sentences, or you would use a transition word such as semicolon, however, comma. Either way, whether you use a coordinating conjunction or you use a transition word, in both cases you are combining two ideas or two sentences of equal significance. Hence the word coordinate, meaning that they're both the same importance. It is important to choose a coordinating conjunction or conjunctive adverb appropriate to your meaning. In the preceding example, the two ideas contrast with each other, calling for but or however. And so I always tell my students that when you write your paper, you should always have Google transition word list. So that way you have a whole list of transition words to use. So that way transition words mean that there are different ways of saying and, different ways of saying but, different ways of saying for, which means because, different ways of saying therefore. And so transition words of addition are different ways of saying and. Transition words of contrast are different ways of saying but. Transition words of consequence are different ways of saying so. And so you can, that's why when you Google your own transition words, make sure that you have transition words of all those different types. So that way when you want to combine two simple sentences of equal importance, you don't always use and, but. So other ways of saying and would be, for example, a transition word of addition like therefore, moreover, furthermore. And then transition words, other ways of saying but are transition words of opposition such as however, on the other hand, in contrast. And so you can find a whole slew of different ways of saying and different ways of saying but. So that way you have many different ways to combine two simple sentences of equal importance. And so note that another way of saying transition words they have many different ways of saying that. You can say transition words, conjunctive adverbs, or transitional expressions. All of those mean the same thing. And when you use a transition word or a conjunctive adverb, you put the semicolon, then the transitional word, and then comma. Or you can have period, transition word, comma. So that's for if you use a conjunctive adverb that combines two sentences of equal importance. So right now, all we've done is coordination. So remember, there are two ways to combine your simple sentences, either with coordination, which is a compound sentence, or with subordination, or subordinating conjunctions. That's a complex sentence. So now that we're done with coordination, now let's go to, here are the coordinating, these are all the words of different ways of, before I go to subordination, I'm still doing coordination. So when you want to combine two sentences of equal importance, you can either use fanboys, for and but or nor so yet, or you can use a transition word or conjunctive adverb, same thing. Also, as a result, besides, consequently, finally, for example, for instance, furthermore, all of that, different ways of saying and then however, in addition, in fact, in other words, in the first place, meanwhile, next, now, of course, otherwise, still, them, therefore, thus. And so if you want to use however, that's a different way of saying but. So these are all different ways of saying fanboys. You just have to use different punctuation. So these, if you use these words, these coordinating words for in between your sentences, then you are combining two ideas of equal importance. Now we're going to move on to subordination. So the word, if you can remember, sub in subordination means under or less. Just like a submarine is under the ocean, okay, or some sub quality of some product, something that's inferior. So when you use subordination, that means that you're combining one idea is important and another idea is less important. So when you're combining two ideas of different importance, that's subordination. So to give unequal emphasis to two or more ideas, express the major idea in the independent clause and place the minor idea in the subordinate clause. So let's take an example, okay? So if I want to say, let your intended meaning determine which idea you emphasize. Consider the two ideas about social networking websites. Social networking websites offer ways for people to connect in the virtual world. They do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction. If your purpose is to stress the ways that people can connect in the virtual world rather than the limitations of these connections, subordinate the idea about the limitations. Although they do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction, social networking websites offer ways for people to connect to the virtual world. And so here, when you say although, they do not replace. This is a subordinate conjunction, and therefore this is a subordinate clause, and therefore this is the less important idea. And then the more important idea is the independent clause, which usually is after the comma. The independent clause is after the comma, which would be social networking websites offer ways for people to connect to the virtual world. So when you have an independent clause and a dependent clause in one sentence, that means that one idea is less important than the other idea. And it's the subordinate conjunction that's the less important idea, and it's the independent clause that's the important idea. When you place both of them together in a sentence and you combine them in a sentence, that's known as a complex sentence. To focus on the limitations of the virtual world, subordinate the idea about the ways people connect on these websites. Although social networking websites offer ways for people to connect in the virtual world, they do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction. So in this case, it's switched. Here you have, although social networking websites offer ways for people to connect, so that's the less important idea. And then the important idea is always in the independent clause. They do not replace face-to-face forms of interaction. Now, if I'm going to read this sentence out loud, I would say something like this. Although social networking websites offer ways for people to connect in the virtual world, they do not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction. Now you notice how the emphasis is on the second sentence. So that means that the independent clause is the more important idea that the writer wants you to focus on, and the other one with the subordinating conjunction, you just read it through really fast. So when you use a subordination, you control how the reader reads your paper, and then you control how the reader thinks. If you want the reader to think that social networking websites is less important, that idea is less important, you put that with a subordinating conjunction. And then if you want your reader to think that does not replace face-to-face forms of social interaction, if you want that to be your important idea, then that way you have the power to influence how your reader thinks. And so that is the power of writing. And so if you want your reader to think of two ideas that are equal, you use a coordinating conjunction. And then if you want to make your reader think that one idea is less important than the other idea, then you use a subordinating conjunction. These are all examples of subordinating conjunctions. And so just like I tell my students that they should get themselves a transition word list, I also tell students you should get yourself subordinating conjunction list. So that way you can, if you choose to write one idea less important than the other idea, then you have your list of subordinating conjunctions to work with. Because as soon as you put a subordinating conjunction in front of an independent clause, it becomes a dependent clause, and it instantly becomes the less important idea. And then the independent clause is the important idea. And then also remember that if your dependent clause comes in the beginning of the sentence, you have to have a comma. And if your dependent clause comes at the end of the sentence, you do not need a comma. And so it's up to you how you want to combine your choppy sentences. You can either use coordination or subordination. So combine choppy sentences. Short sentences demand attention, so you should use them primarily for emphasis. Too many short sentences, one after the other, makes for a very choppy paper. If an idea is not important enough to deserve its own sentence, then try combining it with a sentence close by. Put the minor idea in a subordinate structure, such as phrases or subordinate clauses, and then put the important idea in the independent clause. So here's an example. The Parks Department keeps the use of insecticides to a minimum because the city is concerned about the environment. And so in this sentence, the writer wanted to emphasize that the Parks Department minimizes its use of chemicals. So she put the reason in a subordinate clause beginning with because. And so therefore the first sentence, the fact that they don't use chemicals, that's the important point. And then the reason being, what is the reason? Oh, because they're concerned with the environment. That's not so important. So the not so important reason gets put into a subordinate clause, while the important idea gets put into the independent clause. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal is a 184-mile waterway constructed in the 1800s. It was a major source of transportation for goods during the Civil War. A minor idea is now expressed as in an appositive phrase. An appositive phrase, that's a reduced adjective phrase. That's another. An appositive phrase means that instead of saying, normally you would say, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal is a 184-mile waterway constructed in the 1800s, which was a major source of transportation for goods during the Civil War. And then a lot of times we take away the which was, and that's known as a reduced adjective clause. So you take away the which was, and then you end up with the appositive. So if I say the Chesapeake and the Ohio Canal is a 184-mile waterway, a major source of transportation for goods during the Civil War. So I take away the which was, I end up with an appositive. And that is a totally different lecture. But basically, in this lecture, all you have to understand is you have two ways to combine sentences. Either you use fanboys with coordination, or you use subordinating conjunctions, and when you use coordination, that's two ideas of equal importance. Subordination, that's one idea not as important as the other. That's all you got to focus on for this chapter, okay? I know it's a little bit too much to remember what's a reduced adjective clause, how did the appositive get there, and what's that again? And so forget about that for now and just focus on subordination and coordination. In other words, two ways in which you can combine your choppy sentences depending on whether or not you think the ideas are important or not. And this will help you have more variety in your sentences. I don't think there's any more after this. Oh, avoid ineffective or excessive coordination. Don't use and after after every single sentence. That's not necessary. You probably only need to combine, let's say you have 5 or 7 sentences in a paragraph. You probably only need to combine like one sentence, like in a paragraph. You don't have to combine every single sentence just because you have a whole bunch of choppy sentences. So you got to use it sparingly. If you overuse it, then everything sounds too much and. That means you need a couple of transition words of addition, because then there's too much coordination. Okay, so that's the whole idea of variety, means you use a little of each. And also, do not subordinate major ideas. So if you have your important idea, don't put your important idea into a dependent clause. Put the less important idea into the dependent clause and put the important idea in the independent clause. And do not use so many because. So do not subordinate excessively. There's no need to have because, then that becomes too redundant. So you've got to experiment with many different ways of, you have a mixture of coordinating sentences, and that's compound sentences, and a mixture of complex sentences. That's when you have a dependent clause together with an independent clause, and then together that forms one sentence. So provide some variety. Write a rough draft when a rough draft is filled with too many sentences that begin the same way or have the same structure, try injecting some variety. So vary your sentence openings. Most sentences in English begin with a subject, move to the verb, and continue to the object, with modifiers tucked in along the way or put in at the end. For the most part, such sentences are fine. But put too many of them in a row, however, in other words, too many simple sentences in a row or too many compound sentences in a row, and it becomes monotonous. And so you got to so the very last step in writing your paper is sentence variety. When you revise your paper, first make sure you have good essay structure. You make sure that your thesis statement is the last sentence of the first paragraph, first sentence of the last paragraph. You make sure that all your topic sentences relate back to your thesis statement. And then you make sure that all your supporting sentences relate back to your topic sentences. Once you realize that your essay structure is, I'm done with this. Once you realize that your essay structure is solid and that your essay makes sense, then the very last step of your revision is proofreading, where you make sure that you don't have too many sentences that all sound the same, or you use too many words that all are the same, and therefore you decide whether you want to use coordination, maybe you want to use some subordination in order to connect some of your sentences together. And so sentence variety is actually the very last step in writing your paper in the writing process. And so, and then after that, you check for your grammar mistakes, you check for APA formatting mistakes, and you're done. And you can have someone else look over your paper as well, and you can read your paper out loud to hear whether or not something sounds too monotonous. So if you have any questions about any further, you want to know further tips about better writing, you can always feel free to email me anytime. And so this is Professor H signing off for this episode of Professor H Writing Channel. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime.